Welcome to the Morgan Library Museum. I am on site today talking from one of our offices. So for me, it actually is welcome to the Morgan. As Tony said, I am John McQuillen, the Associate Curator of Printed Books and Bindings here. And my specialty area is European book history from the 15th and 16th centuries. So that covers the end of the Middle Ages and the manuscript era, the invention of printing with movable type around 1455 by Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, and then about the first 100 years of European printed book history up through Martin Luther, up to about, we'll say, Shakespeare in the first folio, which some of you might have seen just made a record at Christie's today, being sold for almost $10 million a copy of it. We have two of them here in the library, in fact. But my interest in this block book, these block books, comes out of this interest in this transition in Europe from the manuscript era to the print era. And block books are works entirely printed from woodcut, from wood blocks. So not handwritten, not the movable type that Gutenberg invented, but another type of printing. And the Morgan has the largest collection of these in North America. We have 19 different examples of the medium. A number of other institutions, libraries and museums in America have examples as well, like the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, and the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. But most of these, of course, are still in European collections. Munich, Paris, London have significant holdings of this material, but they are a little bit rare in the US. So really a topic that a lot of people interested in book history in the US aren't familiar with because they are so rare. So this topic is a little bit of sort of an introduction to what these books are. To begin with, I'll just talk about what the most common texts for the block book are. This is the one I'm going to focus on the most today, the Apocalypse of St. John. It is the book of Apocalypse from the Christian New Testament in a fully visual and textual format, almost like comic strips or a graphic novel, where the scenes from Apocalypse are illustrated with little textual captions in Latin. This book tradition does come out of manuscript traditions. And here you can see the Morgan manuscript of Apocalypse that was produced in England and France in the mid-13th century against our copy of the block book Apocalypse produced in the Netherlands in the mid-15th century. And you can see how close visually these two iterations are, down to the very details of sort of the symbols on the shields are copied between the two editions. In the block book, there's a little bit of change in how the text is oriented and the size of the text, just for the nature of the woodcut medium. But the overall, visual organization and the storytelling was retained from manuscript tradition into the block books, even though it is a little funny that a manuscript that was 200 years old in the mid-15th century was used as the basis for this new kind of illustrated medium. Another very common text is the Biblia Pauperum, or Bible of the Poor. This does not mean kind of financially poor, but actually for the theologically poor, those in need of theological education and understanding. And what the Biblia Pauperum was a typological understanding of the New Testament and the life of Christ. So what that means is in the center of each page, you're going to have a New Testament scene. And here we're beginning with the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary that she was going to bear the Christ child. And to either side, you have Old Testament types, kind of prefigurations in the Old Testament that relate to the New. So the Adam and the serpent in the Garden of Eden with the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and Gideon and the fleece, these sort of revelations of divinity, which sort of prefigure the revelation of Christ here in the central image. Above and below, you have Old Testament prophets who have these little scrolls sort of commenting on this relationship. And what's interesting for the printed Biblia Pauperum is that all of the sheets are labeled so you know where you are. The letter A begins, B, they all go in order, so you can kind of follow along in order. And again, this comes out of manuscript tradition as well. This is a manuscript produced in Germany in the mid 14th century. Again, in the center, you have the Annunciation. You have the serpent here talking not with Eve, but with God the Father, and Gideon and the fleece on this side. And then you have your little prophets around the central scene. A similar organization to the Blockbook, but not a direct model quite like the Apocalypse manuscript and Blockbook were. Interestingly, this Blockbook was transitioned into typographically printed. It's one of the few Blockbooks that kind of made the transition into movable type. And you can see here this example printed in Bamberg, Germany in 1462, a very simple redaction of the illustrated organization, your little blocks for the prophets, the Annunciation, and then your two Old Testament types below, again with Latin text kind of explaining these relationships and giving you the captions for the various scenes, but really like a very fluid melding of text and image. One of the other and most beautiful block books from the period is the Canticum Canticorum, taken from the Old Testament Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, a very kind of metaphorical work about the bridegroom. And here the bride and bridegroom are kind of illustrated as the bridegroom as a Christ figure, the bride perhaps related to the Christian church, but very beautiful illustrations. All the text is in these banderoles that the different figures hold and point to, kind of to indicate who's speaking or what they're speaking about. And it really is a very unusual book in that there is no manuscript predecessor for this. This was invented solely for the block book medium. It then worked its way into other artworks, into manuscript, out of print, and even into wall murals based on this. But it really is a visual cycle that was invented in this block book medium. Another example is the Ars Moriendi, or the Art of Dying, which was a traditional medieval text, extremely popular throughout all of medieval Europe, kind of a text on how to get ready for death. For the dying soul, when the dying soul is tempted by impatience, he needs to be inspired by patience. If he's tempted by demons, he needs to be inspired by the saints. It's this sort of back and forth text, but you can see here the sort of ailing soul in the bed surrounded by saints and an angel while his little demon, is falling by the wayside and running to hide under the bed. Again, this text was very popular in manuscript, both illustrated and unillustrated, and was one of the few block books that actually converted into typographically printed books. So here you see the continuation, the copying of the illustration, but then the text itself here in this copy is in German rather than Latin and in movable type. So it was a work that was popular enough to kind of make the full transition from manuscript to block book to typographic work. The last example I'm going to kind of briefly talk about is the Ars Memorandi, the art of remembering. Again, a work that was sort of invented in the print or block book medium. It's a really unusual work in that they are sort of these memory images for the four Gospels. So you'll go through this book, and each of the openings, you'll have a large image representing one of the Gospels. The four evangelists were sort of symbolized by these certain winged creatures. St. John was an eagle, St. Luke was a bull, for example. And so you have this image of the eagle of St. John, and then you have little icons kind of representing each of the chapters through St. John. And so, for chapter 8, you have this man and woman embracing while she holds this long stick. You have a shepherd's club for chapter 10 in St. John. And then a textual on the left in Latin, sort of the textual explanation of each one, but it is sort of a mnemonic device, a memory aid. If you can remember these images for St. John, for Luke, for Matthew, for Mark. With the images, you can remember the chapters in order. So it really was sort of probably an aid for priests or theology teachers to kind of help you remember the order of the Gospels. Block books are unusual in that they are printed entirely from woodcut and printed on only one side of the sheet. They are not double-sided like a standard book. And because of that, on the reverse of the sheet that is blank, you get sort of the embossed impression of the woodblock. So you would have inked the woodblock, laid the paper over it, and then with some sort of soft tool like a roller, your hand, the palm of your hand, or some sort of padded tool, you would have rubbed across the paper to get the impression from the woodblock, but that leaves a sort of embossed impression on the blank side, which you can see here in a couple of our copies. If you have light at the right angle, you can really see this kind of crazy terrain of the blank side of the page. And this is what's called, in a very fancy term, anopistographic, which basically just means printed on one side of the sheet. This is related to anything, not just block books, but this is just a very good SAT word if you need one. And here is my very poor drawing for sort of how this process takes place. You have at the top left your single block that would have images for 2 pages on it, backwards, remember, in terms of printing. You then lay your paper, you ink your block and lay your paper over your block, rub it to get the impression, and then when you pull it off, you have the right way reading your 2 pages, that if you fold that in half, you have your 2 leaves or facing pages of a book. If this block you were to cut in half so that each page is its own wood block, you can then either reorder pages if you need, but have to be careful of the order you keep, which also can lead to mistakes like printing the incorrect pages opposite each other in this system, which at times, whether by choice or by accident, has happened in the block books. Many of these block books, when you have a bunch of pages, printed on one side and facing pages, you're going to end up with just like a big stack of sheets of paper. And one of our copies that we have here in the Morgan is Unbound, so we can show you this this is originally how you would have bought your block book, as just a simple stack of folded pieces of paper. On the inside of each of these folded sheets is where all of your images are, but this is what basically you buy. It's sort of this stack of sheets. And this is how, like the Bibliopalperum, for example, was produced. Here you have your folded full sheet of paper with your 2 halves. All of this is printed from a single wood block. But it retains the order because you have, A, page B, which of course on the wood block would have been in reverse. So B would have been on the left and A on the right. But this means, you have this sort of almost kind of framed artwork looking, a full piece sitting in front of you, even if it's not bound into book format. And you can read sort of in full narrative order. You go from the Annunciation to the Nativity, the Adoration of the Magi, and the Presentation in the Temple. These sort of, the narrative order of the Bibliopalperum really comes forward in this. When you have full sheets like this, it is clear you don't necessarily have to have it bound into a book, because they do function as sort of full narrative displays. You might actually want to display these on a wall like you would a framed piece of art or a mural. And there is a copy at the Bodleian Library that still has nail holes in the corners of its sheets from when it was displayed somehow vertically on a wall, maybe on wooden panels in a church. So, not every block book is an actual book. Um, this, particularly the Bibliopauperum, lends itself to sort of um, uh, almost like a mural-like display. So again, something that might be also more for public consumption than sort of private reading that you would do alone. If you're displaying it on a wall, of course, this opens up um, the text and the imagery to a slightly broader audience than who might just be able to sit in front of one book and read that one book. The other way, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but of course, the other way to print a block book and turn it into a book is in the more sort of standard book format known as a quire or a gathering or a signature, where you have your stack of sheets all laid together, and as a group, they are folded in half. So that you have, in terms of a block book, you'll have a blank side of the leaf. On the other side of this page are the printed images, which face these printed images. The back of this is blank, facing the blank side of this sheet. On its reverse are the printed images, which face these printed images. It all gets folded together and works like a normal sort of book does. If you think of something like a theater playbill or a church program that are these sort of a Hallmark card in some ways that are sort of these small little booklets of paper. This is what this is. And you need to be careful in this because on your single sheet of paper, you're not printing things in narrative order because your two halves of the piece of paper do not face each other, actually. They're at different places in your book. So you actually want your first image and your last image opposite each other. And then you alternate all the way through to get all of your facing pages of image and text. One of the important parts about these block books, and that has for years had been kind of ignored, is the paper on which they're printed. Now, block books do not indicate when they were printed, where they were printed, or by whom they were printed. The only information is carried as to sort of the date of printing. You only get that from the paper. And in the paper are these watermarks, symbols, there are animals, there's fruit, there are leaves, all kinds of images that kind of act like the trademark for the paper mill that made the paper. There's a modern fine paper even still has this. If you've ever seen held a kind of fancy invitation paper or art paper up to the light, you can see that there's sort of writing like in the paper. That's the mark of the maker. And this was common in the 15th century as well. And so it's by understanding these marks and finding them, if you go from an undated paper to a paper that has maybe a document on it from a certain date, then you know that that paper was made by that point. 15th century paper was not made in huge quantities and sat around in warehouses for years being stockpiled and waiting to be sold. It was produced, distributed, and used fairly quickly. So if you find a document with a date written on a paper with a unicorn watermark, then you know about the date of when that paper was made. And paper did not generally travel hundreds of miles. So paper kind of remained local. So it's useful to understand where the paper came from and at what date, because for something like the block books that do not have dates, then looking at the paper, it helps us to understand a little bit more about when and where that copy might have been printed. And these are both examples of the watermarks in two of the block books in the Morgan's collection. The fantastic unicorn watermarks that were very popular in sort of very northeastern France and into the Netherlands. This specific unicorn we can date was made in Metz, France, about 1466. And similarly with bunches of grapes or certain types of fruit that were also popular in Germany a little bit later. It's funny. It's one of those things that is, paper is so common and these watermarks are there, but you kind of have to look at the page through light in order to be able to see it. And so it's invisible evidence that's there, just sort of waiting to be discovered. If you go to the Morgan's website and in the search bar at the top of the screen, you can look up, it covers information for exhibitions, for all of our events, as well as our collection. So if you just type in the keyword blockbook, all one word, in this bar, you'll get a number of hits, including the 4 digitized blockbooks that we have up on the website, as well as 2 blog posts that my colleague Reba Snyder in conservation has written. She has examined a lot of the inks and the pigments used in our blockbooks. And sort of you'll see there her 2 blog posts kind of going into this detail about what was in these pigments that made these blockbooks. If you, in quotes, if you do the shelf mark PML 21786, you will get this page. This is the virtual, our virtual surrogate, the digitization of this Apocalypse blockbook, which is the main one I'll be talking about today. And you'll get, there's a little bit of introduction and then all of the thumbnails and page images that you can look at along with me, or come back and do it in your own time. So this is our copy of the Apocalypse blockbook. It's what's known as edition 1-2 State 2, which is not really anything to worry about other than it's the first edition, which comes in 2 states. There's a State 1 and a State 2. Our copy is State 2. There were some alterations from the first state, including adding these little initials in each of the blockbooks, in each of the blockbook pages, to the woodblocks so that you could keep the blocks in order. And you would know, which 2 blocks were supposed to face each other when you were printing it on the paper. This ink is very sort of grayish brown. Blockbook ink is not sort of the black, thick carbon ink used for typographic printing. It is this sort of lighter, there's still carbon in it, but it's a more water-based ink. It is lighter, so it's a little bit unusual in that it's not traditional for either a traditional ink for manuscript handwritten books. It's not a traditional ink for typographic books. And it's even a little bit different than basic woodcut ink, your basic sort of woodcut image. If you think of Albrecht Dürer is a little bit late, but just plain woodcut prints even used a different ink than this. So it's unusual in many respects. But this is an example for our Apocalypse. This one is uncolored. You bought it uncolored, and then you could do it yourself or pay someone extra if you wanted certain aspects of your book colored, but they did not have to be. But I'm showing you this uncolored example just so you get a little bit better sense of the quality of the print, the line, and the illustration and text are a little bit clearer. As I said, our copy here on the right is State 2. The first state is a copy that is only at the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. Their copy is colored, but you can see here the initial added to our leaf, the initial I, is missing in the first state. They didn't have that. And so that's really one of the significant reasons, the difference between these 2 states are just adding this alphabetical signature to help keep the plates in an order. The Rylands copy, as well as you can see, is colored, where ours is not. And again, that really is just based upon whoever the owner was who first bought this book and what they wanted done with their copy. Here, when we're talking about block books, because they are printed from standing wood blocks, unlike typographic books that, you know, all 200 copies are printed, in a very short time, block books are printed over years. And this is where the idea of the print on demand comes from. You can see the kind of perpetual uh, degradation of the woodblock in these 4 copies. Manchester's copy of State 1, you could see here at the top right, there's only like a little bit of damage to this sort of the clouds here above the apocalyptic woman. The Munich copy, which is an early version of State 2, there's a little bit more damage. This break along the top is wider. In our copy, which is a little bit later version of State 2, we have a little bit more damage than Munich does. And then in the Bodleian copy, which is again a little bit later than our copy of State 2, there is even more damage. So you can really see, these books were not all printed clearly at the same time because of the continued degradation of the woodblock. And that degradation allows us to kind of provide a little bit of correlative relative dating of which copy came first, which is second, third, fourth. The watermarks are another great way to provide sort of a more concrete relationship to dating. So when you look at the paper that they're printed on, the Munich copy has these like very long anchors with curly arms and this strange Y watermark. And those papers can be dated to kind of northeastern France, around Metz or Bar-le-Duc around 1460. Our copy has a different anchor with very kind of like almost a half circle for the 2 anchor arms and this Gothic letter P with a little flower on its top. Also from the same region, around Metz, around 1460-62 is when they were used. And then the Oxford Bodleian Library copy has this little bull's head with a stick coming out of its head with a star on it. And again, a third type of anchor that's different than ours and the Munich Library's copy. They're all from the same region of northeastern France, but different mills, and the paper produced over almost an entire decade span, which means that these copies, aside from the degradation in the woodblocks, they were also printed over, almost a say 5-6 year span. So looking at the paper, something that is so ubiquitous and yet so often ignored, is really one of the keys in understanding the individual copies of these books, because in that respect, they function a lot more like autonomous prints, like woodcuts and metal cuts and engravings, which can be printed a couple at a time, and then you wait till someone else comes into your shop and wants another copy of that impression, so then you can print a couple of more. You don't have to print 500 at a time and hope that you sell everything out. You can do it in sort of small batches, which is a little bit more, for this period, kind of feasible financial model. And this is where, again, where that idea of sort of print on demand comes from. These block books were not printed in large numbers. They seem to have been printed, a couple at a time, almost to order. But both the kind of deterioration of the woodblock and the differences in the watermarks in the papers tell us this. These are not kind of large singular editions or print runs that are all done together, but kind of done sporadically every couple of years. Another Apocalypse edition that I'm going to talk about here at the Morgan is our copy of what is known as Edition 4. I should say that these sort of edition numbers are not in any kind of chronological organization. Even though Edition 1 that we just saw is the earliest known, That does not necessarily mean that, you know, 3 comes after that and 4 comes after that in terms of exact chronology, because as you can see, this copy of edition 4 from 1463 is actually printed earlier than the copy of edition 1, state 2, that was at the Bodleian, which was dated to about 1465 to 67. So the chronology here is always something important to keep in mind. This copy of our Apocalypse Edition 4 is incomplete. We only have 12 leaves. It is colored, as you can see, but all of the leaves have been trimmed down to basically just the frame around the woodcut. They are not complete leaves. But on the back of most of them is German commentary, kind of telling you what's happening in the scene, and giving you a few, generally some citations from scripture. The text on the front in these in the Apocalypse block book is in Latin. These, you know, these sort of comic bubbles are in Latin, and so you have then German commentary. So you're explaining this image in a very bilingual situation. This is one of the important aspects of these block books. While they are more affordable than having a manuscript made, they are not cheap productions. So you still had to have enough money to be able to purchase one, and the need to, and the ability to read the texts and need to own this book. But these copies that have German commentary inscription clearly come out of some sort of educational or didactic audience experience. Whether that is some sort of school or a monastery with lay brethren who don't know Latin, perhaps as well as the educated theologians. But they sort of, you know, kind of are in this border area between the, you know, the sort of authoritative, like Latin theology side, and the vernacular understanding of the interest in understanding theology and scripture through a vernacular context. And again, this is, you know, 60, 70 years before Martin Luther in Germany. As I said, our copy is incomplete. We only have 12 leaves. And we, you know, I've been working on trying to figure out where the rest of this copy is and what happened to it. Why is it so cut down? One of the things about these leaves, in edition 4, there are 5 different states of the woodblocks. The woodblocks kept getting changed. And so they go through states A to E. The Library of Congress Rosenwald collection has what was identified as state B, the second state. And you can see the changes in that copy versus our copy. This entire right side has been cut and kind of brought in a little bit and a little bit trimmed away. In this leaf, the throne has lost the bottom of both its legs and the king has lost a foot. These are, and then the church in state B has had the bottom of its columns removed. And here we have the complete version in our leaves. This is not damage. This is significant and intended changes to the woodblock. And so our copy ultimately shows the earliest and first state of these woodblocks. This is helpful and very rare in just being able to see what the full extent of these illustrations were to look like. But before these leaves were identified as being from this early state, there's only one complete copy of State A, and it's in a library in Berlin, and no other copy was known. But with these leaves identified now as this early state, we know there's another copy, even though it's incomplete, kind of out running around in the world. And so there is a desire to kind of reconstruct this copy and see if we can find all of the leaves that are the other leaves that our 12 leaves belong to, which in fact they are out there. The Metropolitan Museum has half of a leaf, as does the Fogg Museum at Harvard. The Apocalypse has these sort of two-level scenes. There's an upper half and a lower half, which whenever this copy was broken up, a lot of the leaves got cut in half, which probably a lot of these sort of half leaves, as you can see, are in art museums. Whenever this happened, it might have been an interest of a print collector or someone more interested in sort of art than necessarily the book side of things, who wanted to have these individual woodcuts. And so a lot of the pages were then cut in half and used in more of this art context than the original sort of book context to which they belong. To date now, I have found a number of the leaves that I think belong to this same kind of broken up and dismembered copy. The earliest one, though, is in Nuremberg, and they've had this one leaf, which you see here on the left, in the collection of the German National Museum, since 1856, which was when the German National Museum was founded. And it sort of, this leaf existed in the collection at that point, so it was already there. And that's 1856 is the earliest I can trace to like when this copy might have been broken up. Our 12 leaves come from the English collector Richard Bennett, who bought them in two different groups in 1896 and 1899. The Huntington Library in Pasadena has a copy that has 16 leaves kind of mixed in with an incomplete copy of another edition, kind of shuffled together to make one complete copy. That copy came from the collector Fairfax Murray, and it was in his sale in 1917, but we don't know yet where he found this book, and if he was the one, I don't think he was, who mixed these leaves together, or if he bought it sort of already mixed. Again, we have the Harvard leaf, the leaf at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then last week I just realized that there are 3 half leaves in the Museum Boijmans in Rotterdam, which they got in 1923 from a collector. So there are, a lot of these little bits of this one copy kind of out running around in the world. And it's in some respects a little bit like hunting for a needle in a haystack, trying to track them all down. But it is a frustrating but fun puzzle to try and bring this book back together and see if, as we get more leaves, we can complete that German commentary that's on the back of a lot of them. That might give us clues as to where this copy came from. It'll give us more information about the watermarks in the paper, hoping to be able to date kind of this impression of this copy. It's just going to kind of bring a lot of information together once we can track down, more and more of these leaves. And then I'll end with looking at this copy. This is another edition of the Apocalypse, also printed in Germany about 1468. You can see this copy is colored. But one thing, if you're looking at this, that you might notice that might seem a little funny, this leaf on the left, at the top left corner, is labeled as Folio 1, and its facing leaf on the right, at the top right, is labeled Folio 3. We are clearly missing something. And what we are missing is an original manuscript commentary that it was interleaved with. And here in the top right corner of this manuscript leaf, you can see the original Folio 2. This manuscript that is now in Munich at the Bavarian State Library is sort of the other half of our block book. Originally, in the 15th century, there's manuscript commentary was entirely written out and intended for each facing page, not unlike the commentary on the reverse of our other copy, but here one that is more sort of in a one-to-one correlation facing each image. So you're not having to turn the page to read about what you're looking at. Here you have the exact sort of commentary for each scene broken down. And again, this commentary is in German, whereas the text in the images is all in Latin. So it is sort of a little bit, second level sort of theological understanding and discussion to be discussing these images and talking about them in German and not just solely Latin. This copy is very much like one at New York Public Library, which still has its original manuscript with it, bound in. This is another copy of Apocalypse. You can see how nicely it's colored. They're attempting to sort of, even the original shading sort of they were trying to work on for the building here. But in this facing manuscript, again, where the text itself is very similar to this copy that's broken up between New York and Munich. A very similar German commentary, but still in its original context, facing its appropriate leaves. And so you have the commentary to the first leaf, you have a little bit of an introduction, the commentary to your first image, commentary to your second image, and this goes all the way through the text where you have this German explanation facing the images, which can be used in either kind of an educational or like theological context, or to help sort of elucidate, what this is Apocalypse. Some of the images are rather bizarre and very unclear what is happening if you can't make out these sort of often very difficult to decipher Latin that can be highly abbreviated, and particularly in the woodcut, ends up getting, the wood kind of starts to deteriorate itself. So some of the image just doesn't form that good of an impression because the wood has, gotten wet and damp, and the image just isn't as strong, and the text isn't as strong as it used to be in some cases. So you need, you need something to decipher what is going on in some of these scenes. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there for that very quick run introduction through the Morgans, a very small part of our Blockbook collection, and turn it over to Tony in the chat for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful presentation. We have, thank you all to our attendees for these great questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer or ask all of them, but we will try to get through as many as we can. Our first question is regarding the states. Would different states reflect changes to the original woodblock, or would subsequent states be slightly altered versions of the original woodblock?
They are looking at the evidence, and of course the evidence we have are the impressions, the printed books themselves. None of the original woodblocks exist. The states kind of represent specific intentional changes to the woodblock itself that is then reflected in the printed impression. And again, like understanding, being able to analyze both those changes and the deterioration of the block versus the dating of the paper on which they're printed will then give us kind of more information about how, like, when and how some of those state changes might have happened. And this is why sort of every copy of a block book needs to be looked at, because since they are individually printed, each one is going to have, different paper, a little bit different date, a little bit different of an original context. So it's a little bit of a laborious undertaking, but like each copy needs to kind of be looked at and examined in order to understand what the state of the block was at each of those points.
Our next question is in terms of the paper. You had said that it works on paper. One, was the paper made from rag stock at this time? And our second question is, was parchment ever used to make books?
We don't have examples of any block books printed on parchment. And so paper at this time, yes, it was linen rag paper. So it really is, when you feel it, when you see it, it's much closer. It's linen rag. It's much closer to cloth than sort of our modern wood pulp paper. It's much sturdier, thicker, much more difficult, although not impossible, to tear. And I think that speaks to really the audience for these. Um, Paper was cheaper than parchment. It still was not cheap, though. You have to sort of, keep that in mind. Um, the kind of price is very much relative. Um, because they are all printed on paper, it's a little bit more difficult to get a good impression, I think, one with parchment. So paper was just the more obvious and the better support for this medium. But that also speaks to the level of audience for these. They were not um, intended for sort of the wealthier client who wanted books on paper, books on parchment, excuse me, whether that was, the really wealthy monasteries, nobility, royalty. That was not the audience for these books. It was, one step down where you still wanted a book, you still needed a book, but paper was going to be your supportive choice, not a luxurious vellum or a luxurious parchment. Um, yes.
In terms of the many examples you showed today, could you give a sense of the size of the works, in particular in the ones in the Morgan's collection?
They are, I hate to say size of a standard book. I'm trying to look around me and give you some correlation. They are, generally speaking, about the paper on which they're printed is about 30 centimeters tall. For 15th century paper, if you're into that kind of thing, like I am, it is what's called, the size is called chancery. It's not quite a foot tall, somewhere in the sort of upper 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters is about the size of the book. It is they are not large, they are not thick. These are not massive tomes. They are very sensible, slightly sensibly sized, slightly smaller probably than like a sheet of notebook paper. So very much a single person sized book.
Our next question is in regard to the woodblock itself. Does the Morgan have an example of that? Or does other institute, are they sort of survive through the years, or are they sort of a very rare object?
Yeah, none of the woodblocks for the block books exist. There is one woodblock at the Rylands Library in Manchester, but that probably is a later copy produced for some sort of to like illustrate a publication before the advent of photographic reproduction. In the early 1800s, if you wanted an image, you still had to carve it from wood to print in a paper or a book. I think that the block they have is probably 17th or 18th century for those purposes. It copies an original block book, but it was not an original Blockbooks wood block. There are only a few 15th century wood blocks for printing other things, not block books, but for woodcuts or illustrations in book illustrations in the 15th or 16th century that exist. We have one of Albrecht Dürer's woodblocks here, but that's from just after 1500. There are a few Dürer blocks that exist, and some others mainly in museums in Europe. I can't think at the moment of one in this country, but they are exceedingly rare.
Our next question is in regard to, were the creators of the woodblock, were the printers literate, or were they monks in monasteries? Who created the works of the woodblocks?
It's really hard to know who created them. There's a little bit of evidence in the Netherlands. The name of the town now is kind of slipping away from me. I want to say Utrecht, but that's probably wrong. sort of city documents of wood carvers working on uh, like printed books or printed letters, very strange, um, references to maybe what might be these sort of wood printed books. Um, but all the context that these come out of, as far as we know, are the commercial side, even though the audience for them was likely some monasteries or religious groups. They probably, those monasteries and religious groups were not responsible for printing them. These seem to be more of a commercial production than one that was um, controlled by any religious organization. But as to, you know, the who instigated the creation of these things is very difficult to try and reconstruct from the copies that we have surviving.
How common was the book to have both the woodblock print with the Latin inscriptions with the vernacular commentary in it as well?
Um, Not that uncommon. There are a number of copies, like this one here in New York Public is the only one in this country that has the manuscript German still in its original context with the printed block books, the printed pages of the block book. Um, there are a number of other examples in libraries and museums in Europe, in Germany, and the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. Um, and then there are kind of like the broken up copy of ours that I showed that has German on the back. There are other copies in of various block books that have that, where it's kind of like a all-in-one translation. You have to like flip the pages back and forth to get both the Latin and the German. But there were a couple of the block books, the Bibliopauperum and the Ars Moriendi, had German blockbook versions in addition to the Latin one. So you could get the German text, but the Apocalypse was always, the blockbook was always in Latin. And so if you wanted German, then you had to have this extra manuscript commentary produced.
And our last question, which sort of connects with what you were just saying, was the Apocalypse the most popular subject, and why so?
I don't know if the Bibliopauperum survives in more editions and I believe more copies. Survival doesn't necessarily equal popularity, but the Apocalypse and the Bibliopauperum are the two that really have survived the most. So we might, postulate a little bit that then that means there were the most copies of them originally, and so that survived all the more. The I think because the Apocalypse is so visually stunning and visually interesting, there is, even if you think that some of these woodcuts might seem a little basic or crude or not quite so refined as sort of Renaissance illustration, there is like a very strong liveliness and like beautiful graphic quality to them, whether painted or not, that I think have made them, incredibly appealing for centuries. Made them very popular at their time because they are, fairly clear and interesting to look at. The Bibliopauperum was popular because that kind of arrangement, that text, that genre itself was very popular, both in manuscript, block book, and then in print, in typographic print. It was perhaps a more broadly useful theological tool, the Bibliopauperum, because it showed you, such strong like image relationships, and a lot of those images in the Bibliopauperum were translated into other media, stained glass, sculpture, Of course, they kind of went back and forth into manuscript and various printed incarnations. But the theological relationship within those images, I think, made them very popular across a lot of artistic media. And so they sort of survive in a number of different visual spheres. I can't think at the moment of a direct, another artwork copied from the apocalypse images. I can't think of, like, the apocalypse images from the block book going into stained glass or sculpture. Not to say that there weren't any, but none have I can't think of one, and I don't know if any have survived down to us for that. But I think those two are really the most popular of the block books.
Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of our attendees for these great questions.